there, my name is Kyley McGeeney. I am the Senior Director of Survey Methods at PSB, but I'm here today in my capacity as the Education Chair of the American Association for Public Opinion Research, and under my jurisdiction is journalist education, so this is absolutely perfect. So what I'm going to talk to you today is about reporting on polls. So obviously we know about some disastrous reporting on polls that has happened in the past. How do I make this in slide, like presentation mode? Sorry.
Right up there where it says present.
Got it. All right, so in 1948, obviously Dewey did not defeat Truman, but pollsters were so sure that that was going to be the case that they actually stopped polling in some cases weeks in advance. And apparently the Chicago Daily Tribune took that information and ran with it rather than looking at verified, election results. So we thought this was kind of the biggest debacle in polling, and then 2016 happened. So as a pollster, I have to defend us just a little bit. So we were actually not off for the popular vote, right? She won by about 2 points. We had her winning by about 3 points, but of course that's not how we actually elect presidents. So the state polls were not very accurate. That was compounded by the fact that we had these probabilistic models or election forecasters who were taking the polling information and using it to predict the outcome. So that was problematic, and then of course that was being reported far and wide, and people were under the impression that of course Hillary was going to win. So all of this has led to a bit of a crisis in polling, and one thing that we want to make sure is, in addition to both making sure that we have the best methods possible when it comes to polling, we want to make sure that we also impart to journalists how to best report about polling. So before reporting about polls, the most important things to know are who, what, when, and how. And so I'll go over each of those, and then we'll talk about interpreting the results. So the who. The first question is, who conducted the poll, or who paid for the poll? Are they credible and transparent? So the American Association for Public Opinion Research, APOR, has a transparency initiative. You can go on their website and look at every single pollster that's a member of the Transparency Initiative. Nate Silver has found that those are more accurate pollsters by and large. You can also go to 538 and look at their grades. So you have ways to check the transparency and credibility of an organization. Another kind of easy way is there a methodological statement published with the polls? Or if there's not, and you ask the pollster for one, do they provide it? Most pollsters will, and then you can judge the methods for yourself, but it should be kind of a red flag if there isn't a method statement and they're unwilling to provide one. And also, of course, it's important to think about whether they have a dog in the fight or some sort of vested interest in the outcome. Examples of who sponsors polls, so media organizations, advocacy groups, political campaigns. I worked at Pew Research Center, a nonprofit who does it. I also worked at Gallup. Of course, they do lots of polling as well. Next is the what. What questions are being asked and in what order? So you want to make sure that the questions that are being asked, and you can typically see the questionnaire. It should be published either with the top line data or the methodology statement, or you can ask the pollster. So you want to look for, one, what questions are asked. Are they leading? Are they biased in some way? So for instance, there's this great experiment we did as a Gallup where we asked half the people about the approval of Obamacare and half about the Affordable Care Act. And shockingly, people were more favorable about the Affordable Care Act. So that's an example of using kind of charged, kind of non-neutral language. You also want to check out the question order. People answer polls differently or questions differently based on what they just answered. So if you ask somebody what their party ID is and then you start asking them about their belief on certain issues, they might give a more partisan response. It's also important to look at what other polls have been done on the topic. You want to see, especially if there were other polls that are done at exactly the same time, if your data kind of is in line with those, if it's a big outlier, and if it is an outlier, you want to try to understand why. Another thing you want to look at is the sample size of the poll. So the sample size is related to the margin of error of the poll. So we'll talk more about margin of error, but basically, because you're typically talking to a sample of a population rather than everyone in the population, there's some variability in what the estimate can be. It's called the margin of sampling error. It's just a measure of, if you repeatedly sampled from this population, how much might your estimate vary from all the samples that you could pull. And additionally, it gives you an indication of what the true population value is. So you want to understand what the sample size of your poll is, because that'll give you some information about what the margin of error is. and those are related to each other. Also, for most polls in the United States, you do a sample size of about 1,000 adults. That's pretty common because it's a margin of error of about plus or minus 3%. But what's really important to keep an eye on is if the question that you're looking at was just asked of a subset of respondents, like was it only asked of parents? Was it only asked of registered voters? Because then your sample size gets smaller and then your margin of error gets bigger for that question. So you want to make sure you know who was being asked a particular question, even if there was a large poll to begin with. When. It's important to think about when your interviews were conducted, especially if there was a major news event before, after, or most importantly, during your field period. So if you go into the field right after a mass shooting and ask about gun control, you're probably going to get different results than if you did so, totally disconnected from such an event. Sometimes something happens while you're in the field and you're able to look at your results before and after. That's less common, but it can happen. It's also important to look at historical trends over time. So if you are asking a question like presidential job approval, there's rich, history of data on that question. You can see how your results line up with past results. You can also look to, before you go in the field, look to past results to get a sense of how other people have asked the question and maybe consciously go into it knowing that you're going to want to trend and ask this question in the same way. How? So a really important thing to think about is the mode that the survey was conducted in. So that's basically whether it was a phone survey, it was online, mail, face-to-face, in person. The reason is there's this idea called mode effects, which is basically if you ask the same person the same question, but on two different modes, like phone and web, they will give you typically somewhat different answers. And that has to do with the fact that you're seeing in mail and web and you're hearing on the phone. Also, mail and web is typically self-administered, whereas phone and face-to-face are interviewer-administered. And people, there's this phenomenon called social desirability bias. People want to look good in the eyes of the interviewer, so they're more likely to say socially desirable answers, like, of course I voted, and no, I don't smoke, and I sleep 12 hours a night. So what's really interesting is sometimes you might see a difference between your poll and another poll, and it might actually be solely due to the fact that they were administered by different modes. The last thing to think about for the how is how the poll was weighted. So some groups are more likely than other groups to respond to surveys. So young people, people with lower levels of education, minorities, all less likely to respond. So what we typically do is statistically adjust the results once the data has been collected so that our sample is representative of the population of interest. And it's important to know what variables were used to do that adjustment. So for instance, in 2016, a lot of the state polls adjusted just for age and gender and not for education. And since vote choice was highly correlated with education and people with lower levels of education were underrepresented in the polls, that's part of why their final estimates were inaccurate. So you want to understand what variables are being used for weighting, and then also the source for those. So typically we use census data, either the current population survey, the American Community Survey, decennial census. That's the type of information you typically use for your weighting benchmarks. All right, so putting this all into practice, a tracking survey could be an example of when you apply this. So a tracking survey is basically continual cross-sectional surveys that you do on a topic, and typically the mode and the question or the questions that you ask don't change. So an example, of course, are approval ratings for the president. But what's important to think about is if you do see a change in your results in a tracking survey, has your methodology changed in some way? It could be as big as your mode. Like a lot of tracking surveys are moving from phone to web right now. And since people are typically slightly more truthful, more negative on the web, that can affect the results. Also, you need to look at whether your method or your question wording has changed. So every now and again, someone will slightly tweak question wording and can have a huge effect. So it's really important that those be tested before they're changed. Another thing to keep in mind is that because of margin of error, there is some statistical noise in your results, so there has to be a big enough change in a tracking survey or in a trend for it to actually be statistically significant, meaning a real change in the underlying population. And we'll talk a little bit about that. All right, so now talking about the fundamentals of reporting on polls, we'll talk about understanding margin of error, explaining leads in pre-election polls, writing clear headlines, and then additional resources. All right, so we talked about the fact that the margin of error is kind of measuring the variability in your estimate based on the fact that you're talking to a sample of the population rather than everyone in the population. So it's giving you information about how much your estimate could vary, and it's also giving you information typically about what the true population estimate is if you would talk to everybody in the sample or in the population. So when we talk about 95% confidence, we can say that we're 95% confident, or 95 times out of 100, the true population parameter, the true value had we talked to everyone in the population, would fall within the margin of error of our estimate. So here's an example. If 58% of the public says that unicorns are real, and the margin of error is plus or minus 3%, that means that we can be 95% confident that somewhere between 55 and 61% of all adults, or the whole population, say that unicorns are real. And we can apply this again now for pre-election polls. So in pre-election polls, we do what's called the horse race, which is asking what candidate people are going to vote for. And so if we had these poll results here, where Smith has 48%, Jones has 43%, and the margin of error is plus or minus 4%, who's in the lead? So there's a 5-point difference between Smith and Jones, but what's important to note is that the margin of error is around each of these estimates separately. So the margin of error is, Smith plus or minus 4% and Jones plus or minus 4%. It's not the margin of error of the difference between Smith and Jones. So if the question is who's in the lead here, the answer is neither, because, well, first off, these two margins of error overlap. So Smith's support is somewhere between 44 and 52%. I should say Jones, not Green. Anyway, Jones is somewhere between 39 and 47%. So these overlap, but another way that we can think about it is we can think about what the margin of error is in relation to what the difference between the two candidates are. So we'll talk about that in the context of writing clear headlines. So typically the difference between the two candidates, or the candidate's advantage, should be about 1.5 to 2 times the margin of error in order to be 95% confident that that candidate is actually leading. So it's one way to think of it as the margin of the margin of error of the margin between the two candidates. So according to the AP style guides, if the margin, the difference between the two candidates, is about 1 or 2 times the margin of error, then you can say that the candidate has a slight lead, an apparent lead, a slight edge. It's only if the difference between the two candidates, or the margin, is more than twice the margin of error that you can say that the candidate really has a lead, or a clear lead, or is actually winning. So to see this in practice, if Washington has a 3.5-point lead over Adams and the margin of error is 3 points, what can you say? That Washington leads Adams, Washington has a slight edge over Adams, Washington is winning, Washington is beating Adams, or the poll says Washington will win. So we're looking at a 3.5% or a 3.5 point lead and a 3-point margin of error. So that means that we can only say that Washington has a slight edge over Adams, because Washington would need to have a 6-point lead over Adams in order to be able to truly say that Washington is winning, or Washington is beating Adams. Okay, and then finally, additional resources. So the American Association for Public Opinion Research, APOR, has on our website a whole for media section. So we have a journalist cheat sheet, which is a 1-pager to give information about what kind of questions you should be asking when you see polls, and kind of some information on what best practices or guidelines are for what those answers should be. There's information on the margin of error. There's information on the transparency initiative, like I spoke about. The Associated Press has a style guide for reporting on polls, and Poynter has an online course on polling that they actually did in conjunction with APOR that you can access on the APOR website. And then the Washington Post has made videos about how polls work, and Pew Research Center has actually put out a number of videos at this point about polling, like how question wording works, or why a sample of 1,000 adults can represent all U.S. adults. Another thing to know is that APOR can be a resource for you as well. So if you ever have a polling question, you can contact APOR, and APOR will put you in touch with a pollster. I've done this before. They've contacted about questions about polls, etc. You can also contact me as well, and I think my information is probably in the materials, or we can send it out. So if you ever have a polling question, I'd be more than happy to answer it for you. That's all. Do you guys have any questions about polling?
Is it still mostly landline when you do phones?
No. In fact, when I was at Pew, we were doing 75% cell phone. So we shifted more to cell phone because that's where, over half of U.S. adults only have access to a cell phone. Cell phones are better for reaching young people, minorities, sometimes people with lower levels of education. The problem is cell phones are a lot more expensive to dial. You have to manually dial them. You can't use like the auto dialer. So it takes longer in the field now and it's more expensive, but people primarily are calling like the majority of their interviews on cell phones if they're doing phone.
So what's the hang-up rate? Like, if I speak for a lot of people here, like when I see a phone number I don't recognize, I don't know.
That's the problem. It's not the hang-up rate, it's the non-contact rate. And so what you see is response rates are going down. I mean, now our response rates are about 9%. They've been at about 9% since maybe 9. I wish. No, they've been at 9% since about 2012, and Pew actually did a study where it looks at has bias increased over time. And the problem is that what you find is the people who do complete surveys, especially on the phone, are people who are more civically engaged and more politically engaged. There's some adjustments that pollsters do to take that into account, but we see that often with reports of voting. So people are more likely to tell an interviewer that they voted, but when you can actually verify, like with the voter file, whether or not your respondents voted, they actually are more likely to have voted. So you get these kind of engaged folks who are responding. Yeah. Oh.
So, I mean, I'm not going to jump on you for polls because like you drive me crazy, but like if you're only getting like 9% response and you're only calling 1,000 people, like how do you know it's a good representative of an area?
So often what you do is you'll look at demographic information about the area to see how you're on an unweighted basis comparing to the population parameters of that area. So for instance, because when I was at Pew we were calling 75% cell phones, we were actually pretty close on everything but education. We had enough young people, we had enough minorities. We also conducted polls in Spanish. We oversampled or kind of targeted possible Hispanic respondents. So our percent in Spanish was high, our percent Hispanic was really high. So there are ways that you do overcome it and you can be representative, but they're just more kind of labor intensive and expensive. Yes?
Yeah, one of the problems that we've been facing is a lot of spam callers that has.
Yes.
Do you think like you can maybe make a countermeasure so that when caller ID shows up, there's like a verified that says like this is a truck? Do you think you could work with this phone?
So we're actually having an issue with that right now. Maybe Google can help. So Google marks as spam on its base phone app certain numbers. This is my understanding based on a statement that APOR put out. And so it's based on the volume of calls that have come from that number. The problem is things like when the Census Bureau is doing phone calls, they're getting flagged. When other research organizations are doing research, they're getting flagged. So there's always this tension between research and like telemarketing because they have similar methods in terms of calling a bunch of people. And so things like the Telephone Consumer Protection Act gets applied to research sometimes. So it can become an issue. But anyway, the point is we are trying to get a whitelist established of research, numbers that are used for research so that they can be, instead of marked as verified, rather not marked as spam.
So like you might have like a campaign on TV saying like, if you get a number of call from these numbers, please answer or something like that.
I mean, possibly. I don't think it'll be that, though. The problem is there are so many numbers and they often change. Not change, but like one research organization might have like 30 phone numbers and then you multiply that times 100 research organizations. So I think it'll be less that and more making sure that they're not showing up, specifically as spam on someone's phone.
Because there's also phone spoofing that happens where people can make numbers look like something completely different.
Yeah, so pollsters don't typically do that. There's two things. There's local presence dialing and there's spoofing. So spoofing is when it's made to look like another number. Local presence dialing is, I have a polling call center in Texas. We're doing a survey in Washington. So I buy a Washington phone number to make my calls. That's legal. People were doing that originally because they thought it increased response rates. I believe there's some data that's actually having the reverse effect now because of what you're talking about, spoofing, which is where people are kind of masking phone numbers with ones where it matches your area code in exchange. That's a big problem. So we either have or are putting out a statement about that, about the difference between the two. Spoofing is not, I don't know if it's not legal, but it's definitely not something that like legitimate research organizations do, but trying to explain the difference between that and local presence dialing. Yes?
I understand that it may have
Yeah.
And 9% sounds really, really good, but it's not telemarketing.
Exactly. And to get that 9%, there's a lot that we have to do. We make 3, 5, 7 call attempts depending on the study. Sometimes there are contingent incentives, like if you complete the survey, you'll get a check in the mail. So there's lots that we do, randomizing time of day and day of the week to get that 9%. Yes.
Somebody also wrote a book that I got, a small book about scripts
Oh.
to respond to a telemarketer that just plays with their head.
Oh, that's funny. Yeah, I saw a video of this woman doing that actually recently. Any other questions? Yeah.
For elections, you deal a lot with internal polls, or like as reporters we do, or even
Mhm.
we don't want to get them out. Obviously, they have a vested interest, so like, do you have any guidelines on like how heavily you should discount that or like weigh that in when someone presents that information?
I think it would be helpful to compare their results to other results that might be out at that time. So, for instance, if they have totally different, like they have their candidate up by 20 and everyone has them trailing or up by 5 or something, that should maybe be a red flag. I understand that campaigns are an example of when you do obviously have someone with a dog in the fight. So yeah, I would compare them to other methodologies. I would look at their methodology if they're willing to share it, because I think that will give you some information on what they're doing and being able to critique it. But yeah. Anyone else? All right. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Kyley. So we're going to have more information on polling, and we're going to be working with our friends over at AAPOR and others over the next couple months to try to put together training materials on our